The Sullivan Looking-Glass by Harriet Beecher Stowe. "Aunt Lois," said I, "what was that story about Ruth Sullivan?" Aunt Lois's quick black eyes gave a surprised flash, and she and my grandmother looked at each other a minute significantly. "Who told you a thing about Ruth Sullivan?" she said sharply. "Nobody. Somebody said you knew something about her," said I. I was holding a skein of yarn for Aunt Lois, and she went on winding in silence, putting the ball through loops and tangled places. "Little boys shouldn't ask questions," she concluded at last sententiously. "Little boys that ask too many questions get sent to bed." I knew that of old, and rather wondered at my own hardihood. Aunt Lois wound on in silence, but looking in her face, I could see plainly that I had started an exciting topic. "I should think," pursued my grandmother in her corner, "that Ruth's case might show you, Lois, that a good many things may happen, more than you believe." "Oh, well, Mother, Ruth's was a strange case, but I suppose there are ways of accounting for it." "You believed Ruth, didn't you?" "Oh, certainly I believed Ruth. Why shouldn't I? Ruth was one of my best friends, and as true a girl as lives. There wasn't any nonsense about Ruth. She was one of the sort," said Aunt Lois reflectively, "that I'd as soon trust as myself. When she said a thing was so and so, I knew it was so." "Then, if you think Ruth's story was true," pursued my grandmother, "what's the reason you are always caviling at things just 'cause you can't understand how they came to be so?" Aunt Lois set her lips firmly and wound with grim resolve. She was the very impersonation of that obstinate rationalism that grew up at the New England fireside, close alongside of the most undoubting faith in the supernatural. "I don't believe such things," at last she snapped out, "and I don't disbelieve them. I just let 'em alone. What do I know about 'em? Ruth tells me a story, and I believe her. I know what she saw beforehand came true in the most remarkable way. Well, I'm sure I've no objection. One thing may be true or another, for all me, but just because I believe Ruth Sullivan, I'm not going to believe, right and left, all the stories in Cotton Mather and all that anybody can hawk up to tell, not I." This whole conversation made me all the more curious to get at the story thus dimly indicated, and so we beset Sam for information. "So your Aunt Lois wouldn't tell you nothing," said Sam. "Want to know now, sho." "No, she said we must go to bed if we ask her." "That thar's the way folks has, but you see, boys," said Sam, while a droll confidential expression crossed the lackluster dolefulness of his visage, "you see, I put ye up to it, 'cause Miss Lois is so large and commandin' in her ways, and so kind o' up and down in all her doin's, that I like once in a while to sort o' gravel her, and I knowed enough to know that 'ar question would get her in a tight place. You see, your Aunt Lois was knowin' to all this 'ere about Ruth, so there weren't no getting away from it, and it's about as remarkable a providence as any of them of Mr. Cotton Mather's, Mag Neely. So if you'll come up in the barn chamber this arternoon, where I've got a lot of flax to hatchel out, I'll tell ye all about it." So that afternoon beheld Sam, arranged at full length on a pile of top-toe in the barn chamber, hatcheling by proxy by putting Harry and myself to the service. "Well, now, boys, it's kind o' refreshin' to see how well ye take hold," he observed. "Nothin' like bein' industrious while you're young. Great sight better now than loafin' off down in them medders. In books and work and useful play let my first years be passed, so shall I give for every day some good account at last." "But, Sam, if we work for you, you must tell us that story about Ruth Sullivan." "Lordy massy, yes, course I will. I've had the best kind of chances of knowing all about that ar. Well, you see, there was old General Sullivan. He lived in state and grandeur in the old Sullivan house out to Roxbury. I've been to Roxbury. I've seen that house of General Sullivan's. There was one time that I was a considerable spell looking round in Roxbury, a kind of seeing how things was there, and whether or no there mightn't be some sort of providential opening or something. I used to stay with Aunt Polly Ginger. She was sister to my Headable Ginger, General Sullivan's housekeeper, and had the in and out of the Sullivan house, and kind of kept the run of how things went and came in it. Polly, she was a kind of cousin of my mother's, and allers glad to see me. Fact is, I was pretty handy round house, and she used to save up her broken things and such till I come round in the fall, and then I'd mend 'em up, and put the clock right, and split her up a lot of kindlings, and board up the cellar winders, and kind of make her sort of comfortable, she being a lone body, and no man around. As I said, it was sort of convenient to have me, and so I just got the run of things in the Sullivan house pretty much as if I was one on 'em. General Sullivan, he kept a grand house, I tell you. You see, he come from the old country, and felt sort of lordly and grand, and they used to have the greatest kind of doings there to the Sullivan house. You ought to have seen that 'ere house. Gret big front hall and gret wide stairs, none of your steep kind that breaks a feller's neck to get up and down, but gret broad stairs with easy risers, so they used to say you could have cantered a pony up that 'ere stairway easy as not. Then there was gret wide rooms and sofys and curtains and great curtained bedsteads that looked sort of like fortifications, and pictures that was got in Italy and Rome and all them are heathen places. You see, the General was a dreadful worldly old critter, and was all for the pomps and the vanities. Lordy massy, I wonder what the poor old critter thinks about it all now, when his body's all gone to dust and ashes in the graveyard, and his soul's gone to 'ternity. Well, that there ain't none of my business, only it shows the vanity of riches in a kind of striking light, and makes me content that I never had none. But, Sam, I hope General Sullivan wasn't a wicked man, was he? Well, I wouldn't say he was rarely wickeder than the run, but he was one of these high-steppin', big-feelin' fellers that seem to be a-havin' their portion in this life. Dreadful proud he was, and he was pretty much sot on this world, and kept a sort of court going on around him. Well, I don't judge him nor nobody. Folks that has the world is apt to get sot on it. Don't none of us do more than middlin' well. But, Sam, what about Ruth Sullivan? Ruth? Oh, yes, Ruth. Well, you see, the only crook in the old General's lot was he didn't have no children. Miss Sullivan, she was a beautiful woman, as handsome as a picture, but she never had but one child, and he was a son who died when he was a baby, and 'bout broke her heart. And then this here Ruth was her sister's child, that was born about the same time, and when the boy died, they took Ruth home to sort of fill his place, and kind of comfort up Miss Sullivan. And then Ruth's father and mother died, and they adopted her for their own and brought her up. Well, she grew up to be amazin' handsome. Why, everybody said that she was just the light and glory of that there old Sullivan place, and worth more'n all the pictures and the silver and the jewels and all there was in the house, and she was just so innercent and sweet that you never see nothing to beat it. Well, your Aunt Lois, she got acquainted with Ruth one summer when she was up to Old Town a-visitin' at Parson Lothrop's. Your Aunt Lois was a gal then, and a pretty good-looking one, too, and somehow or other she took to Ruth, and Ruth took to her. And when Ruth went home, they used to be a-writing backwards and forwards, and I guess the fact was Ruth thought about as much of your Aunt Lois as she did of anybody. You see, your aunt was kind of strong up-and-down woman that always knew certain just what she did know, and Ruth, she was one of them gals that seems sort of like a stray lamb or a dove that's sort of lost their way in the world and wants someone to show 'em where to go next. For, you see, the fact was the old General and Madam, they didn't agree very well. He wasn't well pleased that she didn't have no children, and she was sort of jealous of him 'cause she got hold of some sort of story about he was to have married somebody else over there in England, so she got sort of riled up, just as women will, the best on 'em, and they was pretty apt to have spats, and one could give to other as good as they sent, and by all accounts they fit pretty lively sometimes. And between the two, Ruth, she was sort of scared and fluttered like a dove that didn't just know where to settle. You see, there she was in that great wide house where they was a feasting and a prancing and a dancing and a going on like Ahasuerus and Herodias and all them old scripture days. There was a coming and going, and there was great dinners and great doings, but no love. And you know, the scripture says, better is a dinner of yerbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hated therewith. Well, I don't orter say hatred. After all, I kind of reckon the old general did the best he could. The fact is, when a woman gets a kink in her head agin a man, the best on us don't always do just the right thing. Anyway, Ruth, she was sort of forlorn, and didn't seem to take no comfort in the goings-on. The general, he was mighty fond on her and proud on her, and there weren't nothing too good for Ruth. He was free-handed, the general was. He dressed her up in silks and satins, and she had a maid to wait on her, and she had sets of pearls and diamond, and Madam Sullivan, she thought all the world on her, and kind of worshipped the ground she'd tried on. And yet Ruth was sort of lonesome. You see, Ruth wasn't calculated for grandeur. Some folks ain't. Why, that summer she spent out to Old Town, she was just as chick and chipper as a wren, a-wearing her little sunbonnet, and going a hackleberry and a blackberryin' and digging sweet flag, and getting cowslips and dandelions, and she had a word for everybody, and everybody liked Ruth and wished her well. Well, she was sent for her health, and she got that and more too. She got a sweetheart. You see, there was a Captain Oliver a-visitin' at the minister's that summer, a nice, handsome young man as ever was. He and Ruth and your Aunt Lois, they was together a good deal, and they was a-ramblin' and a-ridin' and a-sailin', and so Ruth and the Captain went away all the earth and fell dead in love with each other. Your Aunt Lois, she was knowing to it and all about it, 'cause Ruth, she was just one of them that couldn't take a step without somebody to talk to. Captain Oliver was of a good family in England, and so when he made bold to ask the old general for Ruth, he didn't say him nay, and it was agreed, as they was young, they should wait a year or two. If he and she was of the same mind, he should be free to marry her. Just right on that, the captain's regiment was ordered home, and he had to go, and the next they heard it was sent off to India. And poor little Ruth, she kind of drooped and pined, but she kept true and wouldn't have nothing to say to nobody that came arter her, for there was lots and cords of fellers as did come arter her. You see, Ruth had a taking way with her, and then she had the name of being a great heiress, and that allers draws fellers as molasses does flies. Well, then the news came that Captain Oliver was coming home to England, and the ship was took by the Algerines, and he was gone into slavery there among them heathen Mohammedans and whatnot. Folks seemed to think it was all over with him, and Ruth might just as well give up first as last. And the old general, he'd come to think she might do better, and he kept introducing one and another, and trying to marry her off. But Ruth, she wouldn't. She used to write sheets and sheets to your Aunt Lois about it, and I think Aunt Lois, she kept her grit up. Your Aunt Lois, she'd have stuck by a man to the end of time if it'd been her case. And so she told Ruth. Well, then there was young Jeff Sullivan, the general's nephew. He turned up, and the general, he took a great fancy to him. He was the next heir to the general, but he'd been a pretty rackety youngster in his young days, off to sea and what-not, and sowed a considerable crop of wild oats. People said he'd been a pirating off there in South Ameriky. Lordy massy, nobody rightly knew where he'd a been or where he hadn't. All was, he turned up at last all alive and chipper as a skunk blackbird. Well, of course he made his court to Ruth, and the General, he rather backed him up in it, but Ruth said she wouldn't have nothing to say to him. Well, he come and took up his lodging at the General's, and he was just as slippery as an eel, and sort of slid into everything that was going on in the house and about it. He was here, and he was there, and he was everywhere, and a-having his say about this and that, and he got everybody pretty much under his thumb. And they used to say he wound the General round and round like a skein of yarn, but he couldn't come it round Ruth. Well, the General said she shouldn't be forced, and Jeff, he was smooth as satin, and said he'd be willing to wait as long as Jacob did for Rachel. And so there he sot down, a-watching as patient as a cat at a mouse hole, 'cause the General, he was thick-set and short-necked, and drank pretty free, and was one of the sort that might pop off any time. Well, Miss Sullivan, she beset the General to make a provision for Ruth, 'cause she told him very sensible that he'd brought her up in luxury, and that it weren't fair not to settle something on her. And so the General, he said he'd make a will, and part the property equally between them. And he says to Jeff that, if he played his part as a young feller orter know how, it would all come to him in the end, 'cause he hadn't heard nothing from Captain Oliver for 3 or 4 years, and folks about settled it that he must be dead. Well, the General, he got a letter about an estate that had come to him from England, and he had to go over. Well, living on the next estate was the very cousin of the General's that he was to a married when they was both young. The lands joined so that the grounds run together. What came between them two nobody knows, but she never married, and there she was. There was high words between the General and Madam Sullivan about his going over. She said there weren't no sort of need on it, and he said there was, and she said she hoped she would be in her grave afore he come back, and he said she might suit herself about that for all him. That there was a story that the housekeeper told Aunt Polly, and Aunt Polly, she told me. These here squabbles somehow always does kind of leak out one way or t'other. Anyhow, it was a house divided agin itself at the General's when he was a-fixin' out for the voyage. There was Ruth a-going first to one and then to t'other, and trying all she could to keep peace between them. And there was this ere Master Slick-tongue talking this way to one side and that way to t'other, and the old General kind of like a shuttlecock atween 'em. Well, then, the night before he sailed, the General, he had his lawyer up in the library there, a-looking over all his papers and bonds and things, and a-witnessing his will, and Master Jeff was there, as lively as a cricket, a-going into all affairs, and offering to take precious good care while he was gone, and the General, he had his papers and letters out, a-sorting on 'em over which was to be took to the old country, and to which was to be put in a trust and go back to Lawyer Dennis's office. Well, Abner Ginger, Polly's boy, he that was footman and waiter then at the General's, he told me that about 8 o'clock that evening he went up with hot water and lemons and spirits and such, and he see the great green table in the library all strewed and covered with piles of papers, and there was tin boxes a-standing round, and the General a-packing a trunk, and young Master Jeff as lively and helpful as a rat that smells cheese. And then the General, he says, "Abner," says he, "can you write your name?" "I should hope so, General," says Abner. "Well, then, Abner," says he, "this is my last will, and I want you to witness it." And so Abner, he put down his name opposite to the place with the wafer and a seal, and then the General, he says, "Abner, you tell Ginger to come here." That, you see, was his housekeeper, my Aunt Polly's sister, and a likely woman as ever was. And so they had her up, and she put down her name to the will, and then Aunt Polly, she was had up, she was drinking tea there that night, she put down her name. and all of 'em did it with a good heart, 'cause it had got about among 'em that the will was to provide for Miss Ruth, for everybody loved Ruth, you see, and there was considerable many stories kind of going the rounds about Master Jeff and his doings, and they did say he sort of kept up the strife between the General and my lady, and so they didn't think none too well of him. And as he was next of kin, and Miss Ruth wa'n't none of the General's blood, you see, she was Miss Sullivan's sister's child, of course there wouldn't nothing go to Miss Ruth in the way of law, and so that was why the signing of that will was so much talked about among 'em. Well, you see, the General he sailed the next day, and Jeff he stayed by to keep watch of things. Well, the old General he got over safe, for Miss Sullivan she had a letter from him all right. When he got away, his conscience sort of nagged him, and he was minded to be a good husband. At any rate, he wrote a good loving letter to her, and sent his love to Ruth, and sent over lots of little keepsakes and things for her, and told her that he left her under good protection, and wanted her to try and make up her mind to marry Jeff, as that would keep the property together. Well, now there couldn't be no sort of sugar sweeter than Jeff was to them lone women. Jeff was one of the sort that could be all things to all women. He waited and he tended, and he was as humble as any snake in the grass that ever ye see, and the old lady, she clean fell in with him. But Ruth, she seemed to have a regular spite agin him, and she that were as gentle as a lamb, that never had so much as a hard thought of a mortal critter, and wouldn't tread on a worm, she was so set agin Jeff that she wouldn't so much as touch his hand when she got out of her carriage. Well, now comes the strange part of my story. Ruth was one of the kind that has the gift of seeing. She was born with the veil over her face. This mysterious piece of physiological information about Ruth was given with a look and air that announced something very profound and awful, and we both took up the inquiry. Born with a veil over her face? How should that make her see? Well, boys, how should I know? But the fact is so. There's those as is well known to has the gift of seeing what others can't see. They can see through walls and houses. They can see people's hearts. They can see what's to come. They don't know nothing how 'tis, but this here knowledge comes to 'em. It's a great gift, and that sort's born with the veil over their faces. Ruth was one of these here. Old Granny Badger, she was the knowin'est old nurse in all these parts, and she was with Ruth's mother when she was born, and she told Lady Lothrop all about it. She says, "You may depend upon it that child'll have the second sight," says she. Oh, that thar fact was well known. Well, that was the reason why Jeff Sullivan couldn't come it round Ruth, though he was silkier than a milkweed pod, and just about as patient as a spider in his hole a-watching to get his grip on a fly. Ruth wouldn't argue with him, and she wouldn't flout him, but she just shut herself up in herself and kept a lookout on him, but she told your Aunt Lois just what she thought about him. Well, in about 6 months come the news that the General was dead. He dropped right down in his tracks, dead with apoplexy, as if he had been shot, and Lady Maxwell she write a long letter to my lady and Ruth. You see, he'd got to be Sir Thomas Sullivan over there, and he was a-comin' home to take 'em all over to England to live in grandeur. Well, my Lady Sullivan, she was then, you see, she took it dreadful hard. If they'd a been the lovingest couple in the world, she couldn't have took it harder. Aunt Polly, she said it was all 'cause she thought so much of him that she fit him so. There's women that think so much of their husbands that they won't let 'em have no piece of their life, and I expect it was so with her, poor soul. Anyway, she went right down to smack when she heard he was dead. She was abed, sick when the news come, and she never spoke nor smiled, just turned her back to everybody, and kinder wilted, and was dead in a week. And there was poor little Ruth left all alone in the world, with neither kith nor kin but Jeff. Well, when the funeral was over, and the time appointed to read the will and settle up matters, There weren't no will to be found nowhere, high nor low. Lawyer Dean, he flew round like a parched pea on a shovel. He said he thought he could 'a' gone in the darkest night and put his hand on that there will, but when he went where he thought it was, he found it weren't there, and he knowed he'd kept it under lock and key. What he thought was the will turned out to be an old mortgage. Well, there was an awful row and a to-do about it, you may be sure. Ruth, she just said nothing good or bad, and her not speaking made Jeff a sight more uncomfortable than if she'd had it out with him. He told her it shouldn't make no sort of difference, that he should always stand ready to give her all he had, if she'd only take him with it. And when it came to that, she only given him a look and went out of the room. Jeff, he flared and flounced and talked, and went round and rumpusing among the papers, but no will was forthcoming, high or low. Well, now here comes what's remarkable. Ruth, she told this year all the particulars to your Aunt Lois and Lady Lothrop. She said that the night after the funeral she went up to her chamber. Ruth had the great front chamber opposite to Miss Sullivan's. I've been in it. It was a monstrous big room, with outlandish furniture in it, that the general brought over from an old palace out of Italy. And there was a great big looking-glass over the dressing-table that they said come from Venice, that swung so you could see the whole room in it. Well, she was a-standing in front of this, just going to undress herself, a-hearing the rain drip on the leaves, and the wind wishing and whispering in the old elm trees, and just a-thinking over her lot, and what she should do now, all alone in the world, when of a sudden she felt a kind of lightness in her head, and she thought she seemed to see somebody in the glass a-moving. And she looked behind, and there weren't nobody there. Then she looked forward in the glass, and she saw a strange big room that she'd never seen before, with a long painted window in it, and alongside of this stood a tall cabinet with a good many drawers in it, and she saw herself, and she knew that it was herself in this room, along with another woman whose back was turned towards her. She saw herself speak to this woman and point to the cabinet. She saw the woman nod her head. She saw herself go to the cabinet and open the middle drawer and take out a bundle of papers from the very back end on it. She saw her take out a paper from the middle and open it and hold it up, and she knew that that was the missing will. Well, it all overcome her so that she fainted clean away, and her maid found her a-lying in front of the dressing-table on the floor. She was sick of a fever for a week or a fortnight at her, and your Aunt Lois, she was down taking care of her, and as soon as she got able to be moved, she was took out to Lady Lothrop's. Jeff, he was just as attentive and good as he could be, but she wouldn't bear him near her room. If he so much as set a foot on the stairs that led to it, she'd know it, and got so wild that he had to be kept from coming into the front of the house. But he was doing his best to buy up good words from everybody. He paid all the servants double. He kept everyone in their places, and did so well by 'em all that the general word among 'em was that Miss Ruth couldn't do better than to marry such a nice, open-handed gentleman. Well, Lady Lothrop, she wrote to Lady Maxwell all that had happened, and Lady Maxwell, she sent over to Ruth to come over and be a companion for her, and said she'd adopt her and be as a mother to her. Well, then, Ruth, she went over with some gentlefolks that was going back to England, and offered to see her safe and sound, and so she was set up at Lady Maxwell's manor. It was a grand place, she said, and such as she never see before, like them old gentry places in England. And Lady Maxwell, she made much of her, and cosseted her up for the sake of what the old general had said about her. And Ruth, she told her all her story, and how she believed that the will was to be found somewhere, and that she should be led to see it yet. She told her, too, that she felt it entered that Captain Oliver wasn't dead, and that he'd come back yet. And Lady Maxwell, she took up for her with might and main, and said she'd stand by her. But then, you see, so long as there weren't no will to be found, there weren't nothing to be done. Jeff was the next heir, and he'd got everything, stock and lot, and the estate in England into the bargain. and folks was beginning to think pretty well of him, as folks allers does when a body is up in the world and has houses and lands. Lordy massy, riches allers covers a multitude of sins. Finally, when Ruth had been 6 months with her, one day Lady Maxwell got to telling her all about her history, and what had been atween her and her cousin when they was young, and how they'd had a quarrel, and he flung off to Ameriky, and all them things that it don't do folks no good to remember when it's all over and can't be helped. But she was a lone body, and it seemed to do her good to talk about it. Finally, she says to Ruth, says she, "I'll show you a room in this house you hain't seen before. It was the room where we had that quarrel," she says, "and the last I saw of him was there, till he come back to die," she says. So she took a great key out of her bunch, and she led Ruth along a long passageway to the other end of the house, and opened on a great library. And the minute Ruth came in, she threw up her hands and gin a great cry. "Oh," says she, "this is the room, and that is the winder, and there is the cabinet, and there in that middle drawer at the back end of the bundle of papers is the will." And Lady Maxwell, she said, quite dazed, "Go look," says she. And Aunt Ruth went, just as she seed herself do, and opened the drawer, and drew forth from the back part a yellow pile of old letters. And in the middle of those was the will, sure enough. Ruth drew it out, and opened it, and showed it to her. Well, you see, that will give Ruth the whole of the General's property in Ameriky, though it did leave the English estate to Jeff. Well, the end on it was like a storybook. Jeff, he made believe he mighty glad, and he said it must have been that the General had got flustered with the spirit and water, and put that there will in among his letters that he was a-doing up to take back to England, for it was in among Lady Maxwell's letters that she writ him when they was young, and that he'd a-kept all these years and was a-taken back to her. Well, Lawyer Dean said he was sure that Jeff himself made himself quite busy and useful that night, a-tying up the papers with red tape, and a-packing the General's trunk, and that when Jeff gin him the bundle to lock up in his box, he never mistrusted but what he got it all right. Well, you see, it was just one of them things that can't be known to the judgment day. It might have been an accident, and then again it might not, and folks settled it one way or t'other, according to their opinion of Jeff, but you see how amazing handy for him it happened. Why, if it hadn't been for the providence I've been telling you about, there it might have lain in them old letters that Lady Maxwell said she never had the heart to look over. It would never have turned up in the world. "Well," said I, "what became of Ruth?" "Oh, Captain Oliver, he came back all alive, and escaped from the Algerines, and they was married in King's Chapel, and lived in the old Sullivan house in peace and prosperity. That's just how the story was. And now Aunt Lois can make what she's a mind to on it." "And what became of Jeff?" "Oh, he started to go over to England, and the ship was wrecked off the Irish coast, and that was the last of him. He never got to his property." "Good enough for him," said both of us. "Well, I don't know. 'Twas pretty hard on Jeff. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. I'm glad I warn't in his shoes, though. I'd rather never had nothing. This here hastin' to be rich is such a dreadful temptation. Well, now, boys, you've done a nice lot of flax, and I guess we'll go up to your grand'ther's cellar and get a mug of cider. Talking always gets me dry." End of the Sullivan Looking Glass.